Hello, my name's Shilen Patel, and I'm the founder of three companies. The first is Independence United, which is an innovation company that sits at the intersection between large corporations and startups to create really disruptive innovation. The second is a company called Distill Ventures, which I founded with my co-founder 7 years ago, which invests in startups, but does that really on behalf of a large company called Diageo. We find those startups for Diageo, and then if they're really successful, Diageo ends up buying them. And it's a way for them to do really disruptive innovation, but outside of their company. And then most recently, I've set up a company called Rebelisk, which has really been set up to deal with what should disruptive innovation look like in a post-COVID world. And all of that experience means I've had 25 years at the cutting edge in food and beverages of witnessing innovation at the front line, mostly in food and beverages. I've had the privilege of seeing innovation both be tremendously successful and unfortunately tremendously unsuccessful in both large companies and also with lots and lots and lots of startups. And so I've seen how innovation differs between large companies and small companies. And most recently, I've had a lot of experience across lots of different categories of seeing how people are dealing with the changes that the pandemic and COVID-19 have created. So I wanted to talk about three things today. The first is, how does innovation differ between large companies and small companies? The second is, in my experience, where does innovation go wrong and what drives some of those failures? And the third is, how is COVID having an impact on innovation across lots of different categories? So on the first of those topics, how does innovation differ between large companies and small companies? Large companies are really built for scale and efficiency. They're really good at what I call 1 million widgets to 1 billion widgets. They're really good at understanding their industry as it already exists, and they're really good at taking things to very, very large scale if they're proven, which means that they're generally really good at what I call close-in innovation. Line extensions of existing brands, new flavours of new products, close-in adjacencies. And that, as a result, both the processes and culture that they apply to innovation is built for scale and efficiency. So you might recognise this if you're from a large company. Your innovation systems and processes are normally stage gates. They normally involve lots and lots and lots of thinking, often, unfortunately, lots of paper writing and deck writing. But they also involve lots of time, more often than not, and also lots of spend. And I would characterise innovation inside large corporations as taking lots and lots of effort, but very, very robust. Often people are thinking very hard about what those solutions should look like, but not necessarily getting it away very practically, very quickly. Small companies, on the other hand, are often disrupting. They're often finding new opportunities in new spaces. So whereas in big companies, they're often taking a lot of resources to get innovation away, and it tends to be close in. Smaller companies are often not hampered by the rules of the game that the big companies have to use. They often don't have legacy systems or legacy thinking. They're often slightly naively coming at problems, which is often quite an interesting and potentially valuable thing. But the most important aspect, I think, is their processes and culture are very different from large companies. They're very good at doing more with less, and that often means they're going faster. They're often trying things in prototyping and iterative ways, and they're learning as they're doing rather than sitting back and thinking about what answers should look like. They're often just acting on the impulse of having come up with an answer. And those cultures and processes are very different, and it's not that one's good and one's bad. If large corporations want close-in innovation, then their innovation processes are normally very good for that. The problem is that the world's changing, and pre-COVID it was already changing very fast and in a very big way. And as a result, that innovation needs to be further out, and large organisation systems and processes and culture aren't really very good at dealing with what I call disruptive innovation, stuff that looks at a 3 to 5 year time horizon. And that's where startups, who I think are good at 0 to 1 million widgets, blank sheets of paper to getting to about 1 million of something, they're really good at spotting those opportunities because they can spot them faster, they can move faster, and they can adapt faster. Are the founders of small businesses superhuman? No, they're just normal human beings like the rest of us. Are they extreme risk takers? Well, I think that's often a fallacy that people believe, But often, if you're betting your own money and remortgaging your house in order to start a business, you're going to be anything other than a risk taker. So the potential for large companies to create disruptive innovation by adopting a bit more of the mindset of smaller companies and startups and founders, I think is large. So where does innovation go wrong? Where does failure, when you're trying to be disruptive, happen? Well, in both big and small companies, I think it happens in 3 places. The first of those is not addressing a genuine problem with a genuine solution. Often, whether it's in big companies or small companies, I find people innovating and not really genuinely understanding what's the problem I'm trying to solve. Is there really a headache here that people would like fixed? And even if they've overcome that and they are addressing a genuine problem, their solution is often not really different and really better than something that already exists. And that's crucial. So that's failure number 1. Failure number 2 is even if people find these addressable problems and they find great solutions, in trying to be disruptive, they overcomplicate things. They try and make products that are overly complex and try and sell them in too many places, all at the same time, without really understanding whether any of this is working yet. So overcomplicating the go-to-market strategy, if you want to call it that, is often failure point 2. And the third reason that innovation often fails, I think, is that people don't learn by doing. What do I mean by learn by doing? Often people will come up with a product in their heads, they may even write it down, they may even pitch it. They'll certainly write papers or decks inside big businesses, and they'll ask innovation companies to come up with prototypes or concepts, and they'll make their product. And sometimes they'll do focus groups. They haven't actually put that product in the real world yet. And so I'm constantly baffled by how many products get launched in food and beverages that then never change. They get launched on day 1 and people react to them, and no one goes back and iterates the products or changes them. And some of the most successful food and drink startups I've ever been involved with will go through multiple iterations in the first few months. And they'll often learn by doing. They will put the product into very, very small marketplaces, often digitally enabled, route to consumer, direct to consumer. And they will spend very small amounts of money behind those products to learn how consumers are reacting to them, whether they like the products. They'll often use different labels or different packaging to see which the consumers prefer. And so learning by doing, I think, is one of the best ways to create truly disruptive innovation. Because if it's truly disruptive, you probably don't know what the answer is yet. You have to put it in front of people in the real world and learn from that. But there's one place in my experience where disruptive innovation goes wrong only in large corporations. And this is one of my favourite games to play when I'm playing with some of my clients. You talk to the innovation teams about their innovation ideas, and they will pitch you or tell you about loads of brilliant ideas that they've come up with. But my favourite question to ask them is, great, that's an amazing idea. Would you put the next 6 months of your salary into that idea? And more often than not, the answer is no. In my experience, you can often kill something like 75% of all internal innovation projects by simply asking the project owner whether they would put some of their own hard-earned cash into that idea. And it's a really telling answer. If you don't believe in it, why would you expect anyone else in the world to believe in it? And so the cultural trait that I think large organisations have that creates real failure in innovation is that they don't act like owners. They don't act like entrepreneurs do, who have put their hard-earned cash often into their own ideas because they genuinely believe in them. So how has the pandemic affected innovation? Well, the first thing to say is that black swan events, truly unexpected events of the scale and stature that the pandemic has been, what they genuinely do, I believe, is accelerate change that was already in existence. So we were already seeing some changes in behaviours in consumers. Imagine the move to e-commerce, consumers looking for more healthy, sustainable options, for instance, within food and drink. All those changes, I believe, have just been accelerated. We've perhaps seen something like 2 to 3 years worth of consumer behavioural change happen in 12 weeks. And the net impact of that is you no longer have an excuse to not change some of the business model orthodoxies that you've always believed in. So if you were one of those companies sitting there believing that the e-commerce change was slow and it was going to happen eventually, but you had a good few years yet to go, well, I'm sorry, but all that just changed in the last 3 months. And it's happened in lots of different places, in lots of different categories, on top of just the change to e-commerce, as an example. So what should you do about it? Well, before you jump in and start trying to create lots of disruptive innovation as a result of the opportunities which I think the pandemic will have created, you need to be considering whether the change you think might have happened is actually permanent and scalable. So I often liken the changes that have occurred in the past few weeks to the fact that we've stretched a series of rubber bands. We've moved consumers into new behaviours, and they act a bit like rubber bands, I think, in the sense that the pandemic and the net effects of the pandemics have forced consumers into new behaviours. The crucial question is which of those rubber bands have snapped and those new behaviours are here to stay. An example would be in the service sector. I think the number of people who are going to go back to their big offices in central urban location 5 days a week for most of the weeks of the year, I think that's a rubber band that's snapped, and I think we're definitely going to see changes in working patterns and people spending more time working from home, which means that they'll work differently when I think they're in the office. But there'll be other rubber bands which do slowly or fast snap back into their original positions. So job number one, before you jump into a whole pile of initiatives, is to see if you can work out which rubber bands do you think have permanently snapped and therefore created opportunities, which changes in behaviour do you think are there, and which rubber bands you think might go back, in which case that's business as usual. So I often get asked for advice about how organisations should think about innovation in a post-COVID world. What are the things that they should look to change or look to do? And I think there are 3. The first is don't try and predict the future. It's really easy in times like this to look to futurists and people who are futurologists and writing about the future and ask them to write you a deck or a paper that predicts the future. And the reality is none of us can predict the future. A lot of the changes still haven't been fully formed and we don't quite know where they're going to go. And rather than predict the future, go back to the idea of learning by doing. So hypothesize about what the future might look like, come up with some great ideas, but before you spend too much time and money, try and put prototypes of them into practice and see if that teaches you whether the change is big or not. The second piece of advice I'd give is where you find those opportunities and where, when you learn by doing, you think they're really good opportunities, double down on those. I think fortune will favour the brave here. People who then not only prove those opportunities, but go at them fast, fully resourced, I think will be the people that win when they're taking advantage of these opportunities. The third is now is a really good time to change the culture and processes that drive your innovation. This is a really good time with all of this change going on in any case, people changing their working habits in any case, changing their perspectives on the world in any case. It's a really good time to have a look at those processes and culture that we talked about a bit earlier that big corporations tend to want to use for close-in innovation, and really see if you want to adapt and change some of those to be a bit more like startups and founders. The sorts of things that you might want to try. You might want to try pitching to develop concepts verbally in 5 or 10 minutes rather than paying tens of thousands of pounds to innovation companies to come up with concepts. You might want to try people rapidly prototyping solutions and putting them online and seeing if they can sell a few. These are just a few examples of the sorts of changes big companies can now look to make in their processes and culture. And in conclusion, the 3 pieces of advice I'd leave you with are, number 1, the future's already here, it's just not evenly distributed. That's one of my favourite quotes. It's by a sci-fi author, a guy who happened to coin the internet before the internet was a thing. And what he meant by it was don't try and predict the future, as I said earlier, but look for where the future's already happening in small pockets, and then your job's to see if you can scale those. The second piece of advice I'd give is Learn by doing. Whatever you do, try and turn your ideas into practical solutions as fast as you can, as cheaply as you can, and use necessity as the mother of invention. And get out there and try stuff, because I believe data is the new oil. Learning and understanding what the new normal is going to look like is where the value is. And the third is change your culture. Perhaps ask your teams to act more like owners.